Early in the morning on April 27, 2006, in a cozy home in a small town in Michigan, the phone rang. When the lady of the house answered the call, what she heard knocked the ground out from under her feet and immediately shattered her former life. But that conversation was nothing compared to the second phone call she would have to answer 5 weeks later. On Wednesday, April 26, 2006, a beautiful and outgoing 18-year-old student, Whitney Cerak, was walking across campus to her classes. Whitney was a freshman at Taylor University, located in Upland, Indiana. Her parents had once studied at the same university, and now both Whitney and her older sister attended it as well. In fact, she had wanted to choose a different university, but her parents told her that if she enrolled in a Christian college, they would cover 2/3 of the tuition. If she chose a non-religious school, they wouldn't pay for her education at all. Considering the cost of higher education, her choice was obvious. As Whitney made her way across campus, weaving between groups of other students, she suddenly felt uneasy as she realized how quickly the end of the academic year was approaching. Although she was happy to return home for the summer to the small town of Gaylord, Michigan, where her parents lived, she felt upset knowing she would have to say goodbye to her new friends, whom she wouldn't see again until the fall. During her first year, Whitney had made many new friends. Most of them were freshmen like herself, but she also had a few older friends. She quickly discovered that upperclassmen were just as friendly as first-year students, but they had already experienced many of the challenges of university life and were always willing to offer advice if asked. So throughout the year, whenever Whitney had the opportunity to talk with older students, she took it, believing she could learn something useful from them. That very morning, as she was walking to her classes, she noticed a sign inviting students to volunteer and help decorate the banquet hall for a celebration in honor of the university's new president. When she came closer, Whitney found out that most of the students who had signed up were older than her. Hearing this, she added her own name to the list. The rest of the day passed quite normally for the student. She studied, spent time with friends, and finally returned to her dorm room in the evening, where she went to bed peacefully. Of course, as she laid her head on the pillow that night, she had no way of knowing that only 24 hours separated her from events that would change her life forever. The next morning, Whitney woke up early, took a shower, brushed her teeth, and spent quite a bit of time deciding what to wear. She wasn't vain, but she knew she would be spending the whole day with older students and university staff, so she wanted to look appropriate. When she arrived at the meeting point in the parking lot, she saw a group of students standing near a university van. She didn't know them, but she confidently greeted them and introduced herself. Since she was the one they had been waiting for, they all got into the van. The vehicle smoothly set off north along Interstate 69 toward Fort Wayne. It was there, about an hour's drive away, that the banquet hall where the event was to take place was located. Whitney quickly struck up a conversation with 22-year-old Laura Van Ryn, who was sitting next to her. The two hadn't met before, but they looked so alike that another student even asked if they were related. Two beautiful, tall, slender blondes. They resembled each other not only in appearance. As they talked, they discovered they had both grown up in small towns in Michigan. Laura had come to study from Caledonia, about 2 hours south of Gaylord, Whitney's hometown. Both were also the youngest daughters in very religious families and were active in sports, playing volleyball, basketball, soccer, and enjoying running. When the van stopped, the students entered the banquet hall they were assigned to prepare for the event. Over the next few hours, they arranged tables and chairs, set out the cutlery, and all the while, Laura and Whitney stayed together, chatting friendly and comfortably. Finally, around 7 p.m., the volunteers decided their work was complete. They returned to the van, which then began heading south again. For the first few minutes of the ride, Laura and Whitney kept chatting, but soon, like the others, they began to feel tired from the work. They fell quiet, gazing thoughtfully out the window at the passing scenery. About half an hour later, when the van was already within 2 miles of campus, a bright beam of light suddenly flooded the interior of the vehicle. It rapidly intensified, reflecting off the faces of the passengers, and within seconds, the entire van was brightly illuminated. Someone screamed in terror, and then there was complete silence. Within minutes, dozens of calls from alarmed motorists traveling along Interstate 69 poured into 911, reporting that something terrible had happened. When emergency responders arrived at the scene, they were prepared for the worst, but were still shocked by what they saw. Twisted metal debris, shattered glass, and bodies were scattered everywhere. The light that had suddenly filled the van was from the headlights of a fully loaded truck driven by Robert Spencer. The truck driver had been heading north on the highway when he fell asleep at the wheel. The truck veered off the road onto the grassy median, but didn't stop there. It crossed over and slammed into the van carrying the students, which was traveling south. The impact was catastrophic. The truck literally tore off the rear part of the van and sent it spinning violently. With half of the vehicle essentially gone, the students were thrown out and scattered in different directions. When emergency services arrived, they found Robert still inside his truck. He was alive, but 5 of the 9 people who had been in the van could no longer be saved. A few hours later, early in the morning on April 27th, Whitney's mother in Gaylord was awakened by a phone call. Her husband wasn't home. He was helping rebuild houses with their church after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. On the other end of the line was a coroner who told the woman that her daughter had been in a terrible accident and had died. At the same time, 3 hours south of Gaylord in Caledonia, the Van Ryn family also had to answer a late-night call. But they were told that although Laura had been in the same crash, she had survived and was in critical condition. Her parents arrived at the hospital early in the morning, followed shortly by her boyfriend, Aaron. Laura's classmates were already waiting for them in the hallway. The young woman lay in a hospital bed, swollen, covered in bandages with a neck brace, and in a coma. Her family was told that Laura had broken ribs, a clavicle, an elbow, and a leg, but most frightening of all was the brain injury. Although doctors had managed to stabilize her, it was unknown whether she would ever come out of the coma. And even if she did, her brain had been severely damaged, which would likely affect her ability to live independently. Understanding that, even in the best-case scenario, recovery would be long and difficult, Laura's family decided to transfer her to a rehabilitation center in Grand Rapids that specialized in brain injuries. Whitney's mother and sister also arrived at the hospital. They were just steps away from the body, but the coroner assured them that formal identification wasn't necessary and even discouraged them from going into the morgue. In addition, they were given Whitney's purse, which was dirty, filled with broken items, and carried a strong smell of fuel. It had been found near Whitney's body, and the women understood that the condition of the body would be just as terrible, or worse. They couldn't bring themselves to look, not wanting that to be how they remembered her. Instead, they transported their daughter's body back to their hometown of Gaylord. The farewell coincided with what would have been Whitney's 19th birthday, and her family chose to show a compilation of videos from her previous birthdays. More than 1,400 people came to say goodbye, about half the town. The following day, she was buried in a closed casket. At the same time, Laura's family, who took turns staying in her hospital room, received incredible news. Based on brain scans, it appeared that Laura might wake up from her coma, though it was unclear when. Over the next few weeks, she remained unconscious, but her injuries gradually healed and all signs pointed to recovery. Finally, on Tuesday, May 16th, 30 days after the accident, Laura regained consciousness. At first, it seemed that her brain was functioning normally. Her family could hardly believe it. It felt like a miracle. She recovered fairly quickly and was soon able to move her arms and legs and even sit up. At the same time, however, her loved ones began noticing strange things. Her boyfriend, Aaron, whom she had been dating for 3 years and planned to marry after graduation, was surprised that her eyes now appeared a much deeper blue rather than the greenish shade they had been before. When her shirt accidentally lifted, her sister noticed a navel piercing that hadn't been there previously. Her teeth also seemed slightly shifted to one side. Still, all of this felt insignificant compared to the fact that Laura was alive and recovering, or was she? Soon, she did something that made doctors, her family, and everyone around her question whether her brain was truly functioning properly. On Monday, May 22nd, about a week after waking from the coma, Laura was sitting on her hospital bed surrounded by medical staff and relatives. A doctor handed her a pencil and paper and asked her to write her name. She nodded as if she understood, took the pencil and slowly began forming letters with great effort. But when she finished, what she had written made no sense. The doctor asked her to try again. This time, she focused even more, but once again, she wrote the same name, the same incorrect name. The doctor had to admit that her brain injury might be more severe than he had thought, and that she could be mistaking herself for someone else. However, as everyone would soon realize, that wasn't the case. Something far more serious was happening. The next warning sign came when Laura told her father that they were fake parents. His feelings were deeply hurt. He thought she meant their care for her was insincere, even though it was impossible to accuse them of being bad parents. But his wife began to consider another possibility. What if Laura wasn't actually Laura? Friends who saw her after the swelling had gone down also felt that something wasn't right, that it wasn't her. It was slightly easier for her sister Lisa to accept the truth than for their parents. One day, after taking the girl back to her room following therapy, she stopped, knelt beside her, and said she was proud of her progress. Then she asked a simple question. "What's your name?" The girl answered, "Whitney." At first, there was an explanation for this. People with brain injuries can sometimes confuse their own names. So Lisa asked what her parents' names were. The girl replied, Cerak, Newlin, and Colleen Cerak. Laura and Whitney had known each other for far too short a time for Laura to know that. In that moment, Lisa understood everything, but she didn't want to frighten the girl sitting in front of her. She found the strength to praise her, calmly take her back to her room, and then tell her parents everything. When Laura's father realized that his daughter had been identified only visually, a horrifying truth fell upon the entire family. Laura had been dead for 5 weeks, and the girl they had been caring for all that time had parents of her own, parents who still didn't know the truth. On that terrible day, April 26th, after the crash, emergency responders began working at the scene, trying to determine who could still be saved and who could not. They found a severely injured young woman on the side of the road, barely clinging to life. Medics rushed to her, placed her on a stretcher along with a purse lying nearby, loaded her into an ambulance, and rushed her to the hospital. There, doctors checked the ID in the purse and identified the victim as Laura Van Ryn, while simultaneously beginning treatment. As the bandages were gradually removed, it became clear that the accident had seriously affected Laura's appearance, but her family didn't care what she looked like. They were simply overjoyed that she was alive. However, on Monday, May 22nd, when she was given a piece of paper and a pencil and asked to write her name, she didn't write Laura. She wrote Whitney. It turned out to be a horrific mistake, one that no one had realized until that moment. When Whitney had been found on the roadside, the medics assumed that the purse near her belonged to her. They compared the photo on the ID with the girl and concluded it was the same person. Astonishingly, Whitney's purse had actually landed next to Laura during the crash. A week after Whitney wrote her name on the paper, it was officially confirmed that this was a case of mistaken identity. And once again, in the middle of the night, a disturbing phone call rang in the Cerak family home. It was the coroner, who asked Whitney's mother to call someone else so she wouldn't have to hear the news alone. She called her older daughter, Whitney's sister, Carly. The coroner began to explain that Whitney might be alive. Still half asleep, the woman at first thought he was saying that her daughter had been buried alive. But when she understood what he actually meant, she and Carly simply couldn't believe it. Carly even insisted it must be some kind of cruel prank and said they shouldn't tell their father, who was away again. She recalled that one of Whitney's close friends had visited Laura in the hospital and surely would have recognized her, so it had to be a joke, but her mother needed to be certain. She called their pastor and asked him to verify whether the call had truly come from the coroner. He confirmed that it was true and told them they needed to go to the hospital with Whitney's dental records. On the way to the hospital, they were terrified of what they might see. What would the patient look like if Laura's parents hadn't realized it wasn't their daughter? But their fears turned out to be unfounded. The moment they entered the room, they immediately knew. It was Whitney. Whitney's father and her boyfriend, Matt Wheeler, rushed to the hospital as soon as they learned she was alive. What was a miracle for the Cerak family became a nightmare for Laura's loved ones. Not only did they learn that their daughter had been dead for 5 weeks, but they also feared that Whitney's parents would hate them for having unknowingly kept them away from their daughter for so long. But of course, the Ceraks understood that they themselves had also, in part, contributed to the situation. They hadn't identified Whitney's body, and Laura's family had trusted what they were told. It was like trying to piece together a puzzle without even knowing that a puzzle existed. Both families understood each other's pain. What one had already gone through, the other now had to face. A few days later, Laura's body was exhumed and returned to Caledonia. Although Laura and Whitney had known each other for only a few hours, the shared tragedy forever brought the two families together. For 2 years, they avoided discussing what had happened, respecting each other's feelings, emotions, and personal space. But eventually, they decided to write a book recounting all the events and their reactions to them. As for Robert Spencer, the driver responsible for the incident, it turned out he had been behind the wheel 9 hours longer than legally permitted. He admitted his guilt and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, ultimately serving 2. After the crash, he recovered in the same hospital as Whitney, though at the time everyone believed she was Laura. Reporters tried to provoke Laura's parents, asking what they thought of Spencer and how they would respond to him. But Laura's family rose above it. They showed forgiveness and even understanding, and neither family filed any lawsuits against him. The state of Indiana changed its procedures for identifying victims of accidents to ensure that such a mistake could never happen again. Whitney admits that she doesn't remember the accident itself, only the preparation for the banquet and the pizza the volunteers had afterward. She doesn't even remember the time spent with Laura's family. Her first memory was waking up with her mother nearby. Slowly but surely, she physically recovered and completed her education. 4 years later, she married in the same church where her funeral had taken place. Her husband was her boyfriend, Matt Wheeler, who had supported her through recovery, and they now have 3 children.